Kantian Ethics, Goodwill, Duty, and the Categorical Imperative. This is from his work on the metaphysics of morals. Now it begins by discussing the goodwill. Not the goodwill where you could drop off old furniture or pick up, say, an inexpensive Halloween costume, but literally the will that is good. Now in this first part, Kant is looking at various other competing moral theories. He doesn't mention them by name, but his approaches are clearly directed at these other moral theories. Now he claims that only the good will is good without qualification. And this is being contrasted with what we saw when we looked at virtue theory. As Kant notes, he claims that intelligence, wit, judgment, courage, resolution, perseverance, and so forth are regarded as good, but may become bad without a good will. Things like power, riches, honor, health, and happiness can inspire pride and presumption without a good will to correct their negative influence. Now, when we looked at consequentialism, specifically utilitarianism, we noted that Mill presented his moral view that actions are right in the tendency they promote happiness, bad as they tend to promote the reverse of happiness, namely unhappiness. And Kant looks at the notion of even being worthy of happiness, and he claims that to see someone without a good will enjoying prosperity would not be pleasing to an impartial, rational spectator. So, a good will, he claims, is necessary to even being worthy of happiness. So he's not going to go looking at happiness itself as being a good thing. He's going to look at it in terms of proving oneself worthy of this happiness. Now turning back to the matter of virtues, he does note that some qualities do serve the good will, but they lack intrinsic, unconditional value. In other words, they're not inherently good, and he claims they presuppose or assume a good will in order to be good. He notes the classic virtues, moderation, self-control, and calm deliberation are regarded as good and seen to be part of the intrinsic worth of a person. But he claims they are not good without qualification, though he is critical and notes that the ancients allegedly believed so. And he says that without the principles of a good will, they become very bad indeed. And he sort of illustrates this by talking about how a villain who has coolness will become far more dangerous. Or to step away from Kant, think of an evil character. Take the evil character of your choice from a movie or TV show. Someone like a classic, Darth Vader. And it's all the positive qualities that the villain has, say being courageous, strong, intelligent, charismatic, and persuasive, that make the villain even more dangerous. And so Kant seems to have a reasonable point here. Now this notion is not unique to Kant. Socrates, for example, argued for the unity of the virtues, that a person who only had some of the virtues might prove rather dangerous indeed. And essentially Kant is duplicating that argument. Now turning back to the goodness of the good will, he presents it explicitly in contrast with the sort of consequentialist approaches we looked at in the section on consequentialism. As he notes, a good will is good in and of itself, not based on what it does or its ability to obtain an end. And he claims it is to be esteemed much higher than all it can bring about. And to be rather extreme about this, he says that even if it couldn't achieve its purpose and only remained just the willing, it would shine by its own light and have its whole value in itself. Now by this willing, he doesn't mean just a person saying, gosh, I'd really like to help people, but this couch is so comfortable and these Cheetos are so delicious and this reality show is just so awesome that I can't do that. Now he means truly willing with all one's power. If one does that willing, even if one does not succeed in one's goals in terms of bringing about the goodness, for Kant it's the willing that matters. And he says that the usefulness or fruitfulness of the willing cannot add to the value of the willing nor take away from it. So he's rather explicitly noting that it is not the consequences of the will that matter, it is the will itself. So it is the willing that decides whether it is good or bad. So how does he go about sorting out what we should and should not do? Well, he assesses the moral worth in terms of presenting maxims and how they relate to the universal law. The moral worth of an action, as he sees it, is not based on the effect. So it's not the consequences that matter. What's his reasoning for this? Well, his view is that all positive effects and promotion of the happiness of others could have been caused in other ways, without there being a need for the will of a rational being. And hence, as he sees it, this suffices. So what then is the good? Well, as you might imagine for him, the supreme and unconditional good is only in the good will. And the preeminent good consists only in the conception of law. That is, not the effect, but how much the law determines the will. So his view is to be motivated by the consequences is not what makes something wrong or right. It is being motivated by the conception of law. Now, this is where he lays down what he thinks the distinction is between beings of moral worth and beings that don't have this. And as he sees it, only rational beings can do this, that can act in the conception of the law based on their will, because only rational beings have, understanding and will. Now, in terms of why we don't have to see the consequences, we don't have to, like the consequentialists would claim, wait to see what effect the action has. As Kant sees it, the good is already in the person by their willing. If they will the good, that's good. If they will the bad, that is bad. So you don't have to wait to see the result occur. So the choice itself is either good or bad. So what is this law stuff and how does this theory work? Well, his rule, roughly put, is this. Suppose you're trying to sort out what you should and shouldn't do. And what he claims is that a person is never to act otherwise than so that they could will that their maxim should become a universal law. What does he mean by this? Well, by maxim, he doesn't mean the magazine. He means a self-given, self-interested permission to act. In other words, I give myself permission to do something that I want to do. It's in my self-interest. Now, the universal law in this case that corresponds to the maxim would be if everyone could do it. So kind of crudely put, his test is this. If I can will consistently that if I'm allowed to do it and everyone is allowed to do it as well, then it passes the test. If I can't will that rationally, then it fails the test. Now that's a pretty extreme claim. So what kind of proof does he offer? Well, unfortunately not much. He just says the common reason of men perfectly coincides with this, which seems like a pretty weak argument. Now to illustrate his view, he presents the following example. He says, imagine a scenario like this, a scenario no doubt all of us have been in, where we are, say, lacking in money, and a person in this situation might consider making a promise, namely that they will, promise to pay back the money when actually they cannot, and they have no intention of keeping it. Now Kant says there's two distinct questions here. The first question is it prudent to do it? In other words, would it be a smart or wise thing to do? And this would involve sorting out, how likely is it that I'd get away with it? If I didn't get away with it, what would be the consequences in terms of legal penalties, fines, jail time, or whatever? The second question is it right? And Kant considered these to be two distinct questions. Is it prudent and is it right? Because he believes it is very different to be honest or truthful from duty, from a belief that it's the right thing to do, and being truthful out of fear of the bad consequences. And he does believe that ignoring, the maxim may be advantageous, although following it would be safer. So his view basically is when you're asking whether it's good or not, the question is not what are the consequences. The question is basically, does it match the law? So the obvious question at this point is, how do you tell? Well, basically what he does is this. Should I accept that my maxim be a universal law for myself and others? Should I be able to say in this particular example, everyone may make a deceitful promise when he finds himself in difficulty from which he cannot otherwise extract himself? And if the answer is yes, then the action would be okay. If the answer is no, it would not be. Now Kant claims that in this case, it cannot be willed. Why not? Well, because in order to have lying work, interestingly or boringly enough, it has to be the exception rather than the rule. Because if everyone could lie, if that were the universal law, then no one would believe in promises, because people would know that the law is everyone can lie. So it's only when lying is an exception that it's advantageous. And so for Kant, since a person cannot consistently will that, in my case, that I can lie, I cannot consistently will that everyone can lie, because I want to lie to get an advantage, but if it's a universal law, that advantage would be destroyed. Hence, the action would be wrong. So the test, boiling it down, is to determine the good, is simply this. To ask in Kant's own words, canst thou also will that thy maxim should be a universal law? If not, it must be rejected, not because of the consequences, but because, according to Kant, it cannot be a principle of possible universal legislation. And so as he sees it, duty is a matter of acting from pure respect for the practical law, and he believes that every other motive must yield to this, because, as we saw previously, this is the condition of the good will, and its worth, according to Kant at least, is above everything. Now, his actual moral view, again to give a fancy term for it, is known as the categorical imperative. And according to Kant, all things in nature work in accord with laws. And rational beings like us have a special quality. We have the will. We can act according to the conception of laws and principles, as opposed to simply being, dragged along by the laws. Now, in terms of the imperative part, he claims all imperatives, which are commands, are either hypothetical or categorical. And a hypothetical imperative is basically this. It essentially says, if you want this, then do that. So if you want to make money, buy low, sell high. Or if you want to lose weight, exercise, eat less. Those types of things. Those are hypothetical, on the condition that you want this, do this. Or to achieve this end, do this. Now, the categorical imperative, though, categorical basically means not if you want this, then do this. It simply is do this. So there's no hypothetical. It is categorical. So for him, the categorical imperative is this. Act as if the maxim of thy action were to become, by thy will, a universal law of nature. Now to illustrate his theory, he presents 4 examples. Many thinkers believe that only one of the examples actually works, but interestingly or boringly enough, they all correspond quite clearly, explicitly with biblical ethics, namely, suicide is wrong, lying is wrong, letting your talents rust is wrong, and being a good Samaritan is right. But we'll briefly look at each of these examples and how Kant thinks that they work. The first one involves suicide. In each of these cases, Kant presents a scenario in which a person is faced with a moral challenge. And in each case, what the person does is they use Kant's method. They present their maxim, they follow it up by seeing if they can will the corresponding universal law, and the appropriate conclusion is drawn. So in case 1, suicide. The person's situation is a pretty grim one. A person has been reduced to despair because of all these misfortunes in his life. But he asks himself, would it be against duty to himself to commit suicide? So Kant crafts the following maxim: from self-love, I will end my life when its continuation is likely to bring more evil than satisfaction. So his test is, can this principle become a universal law of nature? Now the way Kant does this is seen by some as kind of a warping of his actual method, kind of like a trick. What he does is this. He says, a system of nature, including a law to destroy life, by means of what is supposed to impel its improvement, is a contradiction. Because his view is that, according to the way he sets it up, a person wants to kill themselves out of self-love. But as he sees it, self-love, its purpose, is to keep us, alive. And so that would be a contradiction. Namely, that out of what is supposed to keep me alive, I shall kill myself. And so he says it's inconsistent, it's a contradiction, therefore it cannot be a law of nature. So he claims suicide is wrong. So the key thing for Kant, given he's an absolutist, is that suicide is wrong and always wrong, no matter what. His second case is the case of lying promises. We've already gone through this example, so I won't repeat it again, except to say that, it essentially repeats the original example. And of course, it's based on most likely the biblical notion about, lying. Now, the third case involves rusting talents. And this, of course, is based on the classic parable of the talents. And in that parable, we have a person who's leaving to go to town, and he entrusts his servants with talents, which is a unit of money. And he gives, some to one servant, some to another, and one servant gets but one talent. And this servant, afraid to lose what he has gotten, hides it, conceals it. And of course, when the person comes back to town, he says, why do you hide your talent even though you just have but one? And the point of that story is, of course, is that you shouldn't hide your talents. You need to develop them. Now, and he presents the following situation. Imagine we have a person who's got a talent that's, if it were developed, it might make the person useful in many respects. They could be, say, a doctor or an engineer or someone who, makes things, skilled at the crafts or building. But the person is in comfortable circumstances. Let us suppose, for example, that they could do very well as, a mechanic or an engineer or a doctor, but they've won the lottery, so they're pretty well off. And they prefer to simply enjoy themselves rather than improve their natural capacities. So basically, they're doing well, they don't need to develop these talents, and so they just kind of want to, slack, to live an enjoyable life. Now, in the face of it, we might think, well, even though we might say, what a terrible waste, we might not think that this is morally wrong. But Kant says it is. Why? Well, this is what he claims. He says, in this situation, one cannot will this. Why not? Well, he claims that rational beings necessarily, that is to say, they must, will their faculties to be developed, since they serve them and were given them for many purposes. And that doesn't seem to really match his actual theory, because essentially says, well, if you're rational, you just got to accept this. You can't do this. And so he tries to cast it as a contradiction, that being rational by its very nature entails that you must develop your talents. And so if you don't, that would be a contradiction. Or so he claims. Now his fourth example, that of helping others, is of course the parable of the Good Samaritan. And of course the parable where someone has fallen among thieves and they're badly wounded and robbed. But luckily for them, they're found by a Samaritan who aids them, binds their wounds, helps them, takes them back to town, and otherwise helps them out. And it's presented as a parable to encourage us to be kind, to be our brothers and sisters' keepers. Now Kant presents the following scenario in his Ethics. Here's a situation. We have someone who's doing very well. They're, say, rich and successful. And of course they see other people in wretchedness and poverty. And though he could help them quite easily, he regards it as no concern of his own. Now, he's not going to harm them, but he doesn't wish to assist them, and he believes that everyone can be as happy as heaven pleases, or as he can make himself. So his view is essentially everyone's on their own. If you're successful, great. If you don't succeed, well, too bad, but you're owed nothing. And so for Kant, the person has to run it through the test. And here's how, for Kant, the test would go. If there were a universal law, he claims, it's impossible for someone to actually make this universal law. That is to say, it could not be a universal law. Why? Well, this is how he presents it. He says, could a person do this? Well, the maxim would be, when others are in need, I shall not help them. The universal law would be, when anyone else is in need, no one shall help them. And Kant presents the view that the person can't will this, because someday he might need the love and sympathy of others, but this law would deprive him of all hope. So his claim is he can't will that, because he himself would want to be helped by others. He cannot will that he not help others. But again, this seems to be a real stretch given his theory, but that's what Kant claims. Since I might want to be helped someday, I'm obligated to help others, or so he claims. Now, we now turn to, for Kant, his discussion of ends. Now, moral philosophers in general have to answer the question about the scope of morality. That is to say, which things, which beings are morally relevant, which count, and which ones are not relevant, which ones don't count. And we saw when we looked at John Stuart Mill that he takes a fairly generous approach. All human beings, and as far as the nature of things permits, sentient creation, things that feel pleasure or pain, matter. Kant, though, has a much stricter view. He does take rational beings, us and all rational beings, considering the possibility of non-human rational beings. We exist, as he sees it, as ends, not merely as means. And so we must be regarded as ends, not just as means. Now what about the other stuff? Well, he calls all the other things the objects of the inclination. And these have only a conditional worth. Namely, the idea is basically if we did not value them, they would lack value. Going back to our terminology from the ancient days of Part 1, the idea is that they have merely extrinsic value. They are valuable because we value them as means to ends. In contrast, as rational beings, we have value because we are intrinsically valuable. We are valuable because we are valuable. Now, in the case of rational beings again, we are ends. We're not subjective means. Why? Well, one reason he gives for this is an argument, the regress argument, namely that if all worth were contingent, that is to say, if all value was extrinsic, if everything was valuable because of something else, there would be no ultimate good. And this is an argument, we saw in Aristotle for happiness, and we see it here again in Kant, that basically in order for there to be any, say, value, he claims there's got to be something that's of value in and of itself. Otherwise, the infinite regress would prevent that from being the case. Now he presents at this point what he calls the supreme practical principle, which some present as the second formulation of the categorical imperative. And he claims that if there is such a principle, it must be drawn from what is necessarily an end for everyone. And he claims it's this. The foundation for this principle is that rational nature exists as an end in itself. In other words, a rational being is an end, not merely a means. Now, a good question would be, of course, why think this? Why accept this as true? Well, as Kant sees it, he claims that each rational being sees its existence as such. In other words, I regard myself as a being that is an end, not merely a means to be used. And I have to extend that same principle to others. Essentially, crudely put, his reasoning is, if I'm a rational being and I accept myself as an end because I'm a rational being, I have to extend that same principle to other rational beings. Because if being rational makes me an end, being rational makes them ends as well. Otherwise, that'd be inconsistent. So the practical imperative, as he sees it, is actually pretty nice. It is this: so act as to treat humanity, whether in your own person or that of any other, in every case as an end withal, never as a means only. So essentially, we can't treat people just as means. Now, in case you're wondering, does this mean that you can never treat people as means? For example, that if you go to, you know, Publix to buy groceries, that you're doing something wrong if someone's, the cashier is ringing you out. Or if you go to the doctor and they treat you for, say, the flu or the strep throat. Are you doing wrong because you're using them as a means? Well, for Kant, no. If you're treating them as an end, while you're also engaged in treating them as a means in a way that's consistent, then there's no problem. It's only if we use a person as means only. So, for example, killing and robbing someone would treat them simply as a means to money, and that would be wrong. Now, for Kant, all of us rational beings form what he calls the kingdom of ends. Even though we don't, have like passports to this kingdom, so to speak, what it basically takes it to be is all of us rational beings, we form this kingdom. What does that mean? Well, the idea is this. It's sometimes presented as the third formulation of the categorical imperative, which is the idea of the will of every rational being as making universal law. This is the principle of autonomy. Why have this? Well, for Kant, the autonomy of the will is based on freedom. If our moral principles were based on external authority, that is to say, we were simply told, say by God, what is right and what is wrong, our will is not free because we are compelled. Well, interestingly enough for Kant, if our moral principles are based on our own inclinations, our desires, our emotions, our passions, our will is not free either because we are driven by our passions. And so, for Kant, what is required is that the moral law must not be imposed from the outside. Rather, it's an expression of our own rational nature. So as moral agents, we are bound by the moral law. But it is not an imposition on our will because we are the legislators of the moral law. In other words, we are autonomous in the sense that we're not imposed on from the outside. We are the law makers. So crudely put, we are sovereign beings. We decide on the laws. And the way we determine these laws, shockingly enough for Kant, is using the categorical imperative. And that brings us to the end of our brief look at Kant's discussion of the categorical imperative. Next, we'll take a look at Kant's famous three postulates of morality.